Sometimes the greatest miracle does not arrive with flashing lights or loud applause. Sometimes it begins with a child quietly saying, "Follow me." The morning skyline of Manhattan shimmered beneath a clear blue October sky, as Alexander Hayes stepped out of the glass headquarters of Hayes Capital. At 39, the white millionaire had become one of the city's most respected investors, known for making impossible decisions look effortless. His calendar was measured in billion-dollar opportunities, private board meetings, and international flights that rarely left room for anything unexpected. Today was supposed to be no different. A line of black SUVs waited outside the building, while assistants hurried across the sidewalk carrying tablets and briefcases. Reporters lingered behind security barriers, hoping for a comment about Alexander's latest acquisition. Across the street, office workers filled the coffee shops while tourists admired the towering skyscrapers that reflected the bright autumn sunlight like polished mirrors. The city moved with its usual confidence, every second carefully scheduled, every destination already decided. Alexander thanked his driver and chose to walk the final 2 blocks to a charity luncheon instead. He had promised himself that once a week he would experience the city without tinted windows separating him from ordinary life. The crisp air carried the scent of roasted coffee, fresh pretzels, and fallen maple leaves. Street musicians filled the corners with gentle jazz while children laughed outside a nearby public library. For a brief moment, the pressure of business disappeared. Then everything changed. A small hand suddenly wrapped around the sleeve of his navy overcoat. Alexander turned in surprise and found himself looking into the calm brown eyes of a black boy no older than 8 years old. The child wore a neatly washed green hoodie, blue jeans, and well-used sneakers that had clearly been cared for with pride. His breathing remained steady. His expression showed no fear, only quiet certainty. "Do not move," the boy said softly. "Follow me." Alexander blinked in confusion. Around them, hundreds of people continued, walking without noticing the strange encounter unfolding on the crowded sidewalk. The child did not ask for money. He did not smile for attention. Instead, he gently tugged Alexander one step backward and then another until they stood beneath the entrance canopy of a nearby bookstore. Barely 3 seconds later, a large decorative sign that had been hanging above a neighboring storefront broke free after years of weathering. It crashed harmlessly onto the exact section of sidewalk where Alexander had been standing moments earlier. The sound echoed through the street. Pedestrians stopped instantly. Several people gasped while others hurried forward to check whether anyone had been injured. The bookstore owner rushed outside in disbelief, staring at the fallen sign before looking toward Alexander with relief. Alexander remained completely speechless. His heartbeat pounded against his chest as he stared at the empty space where he had almost been standing. Slowly he turned back toward the boy. The child showed no excitement over what had just happened. He simply offered a small, polite smile, as though helping a stranger was the most ordinary thing in the world. Before Alexander could speak, the boy quietly released his sleeve and pointed toward a woman waiting across the street. A graceful black woman stood beside a bus stop wearing a simple beige coat and holding 2 reusable grocery bags. She watched the boy with calm, trusting eyes instead of panic, as though she had complete confidence in every choice he made. The child waved warmly before jogging toward her. Alexander finally found his voice. "Wait," he called. But the boy only smiled over his shoulder and continued walking beside the woman, disappearing into the flow of autumn sunlight and city crowds, leaving behind a millionaire who had spent a lifetime believing he controlled every moment, only to discover that the most important moment of his life had just been placed into the hands of a quiet child who wanted nothing in return. Alexander stood motionless beneath the bookstore canopy long after the crowd had begun to disperse. Emergency workers quickly secured the sidewalk while business owners checked the surrounding storefronts, relieved that no one had been standing beneath the fallen sign. Reporters who had recognized the city's well-known investor rushed toward him with microphones, eager to capture another business headline. But Alexander quietly declined every question. For the first time in years, the most important conversation waiting for him had nothing to do with investments or markets. It belonged to an 8-year-old boy who had walked away without asking for recognition. The charity luncheon, the executives, and the carefully planned schedule suddenly seemed insignificant. Instead of stepping into the waiting sport utility vehicle, Alexander looked across the busy street, hoping to catch another glimpse of the child and the woman in the beige coat. They had already disappeared into the rhythm of the city. His driver approached respectfully. "Sir, everyone is waiting for you downtown." Alexander glanced once more toward the corner where the pair had vanished. "Cancel the luncheon," he answered calmly. The driver stared in surprise. In 12 years of working together, he had never heard Alexander cancel an important event at the last minute. Yet something in his employer's expression made it clear that no further explanation was needed. Nearly an hour later, security footage from nearby businesses helped Alexander retrace the direction the woman and child had taken. He instructed his assistant not to investigate their finances, employment, or personal history. "I am not looking for a background report," he explained. "I only want to thank them." By late afternoon he spotted them again in a quieter neighborhood several miles north of Midtown. The boy, whose name he still did not know, walked beside the woman carrying one reusable grocery bag while she balanced another against her shoulder. They laughed together over something simple, completely unaware that one of the city's wealthiest men watched from across the street with growing curiosity. The child noticed an elderly man struggling to carry 2 heavy shopping bags up the steps of a brownstone. Without hesitation, he handed his own groceries to the woman and hurried over to help. The elderly man smiled warmly as the boy carefully carried one bag all the way to the front door. When he returned, the woman gently brushed a few curls away from his forehead and whispered something that made him smile even brighter. There was no applause. No cameras. Just kindness practiced so naturally that it seemed woven into everyday life. Alexander found himself remembering the countless leadership seminars he had attended over the years. None of them had ever explained character as clearly as the quiet example unfolding before him. He crossed the street, determined not to let another opportunity disappear. Before he could speak, however, the woman turned toward him with calm recognition, as though she had expected this meeting all along. The boy looked up and smiled politely. "Mom," he said, "that is the man from this morning." The woman nodded with gentle composure before extending her hand. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "I believe you have been looking for us." Alexander accepted her handshake, noticing the quiet confidence in her eyes. "Yes," he replied honestly. "I have been trying to find the 2 people who changed my life before lunchtime, and I still do not even know your names." The woman smiled with quiet warmth before introducing herself. "My name is Simone Carter," she said gently. Then she rested a loving hand on the boy's shoulder. "And this is my son, Jordan." The boy offered a polite smile that carried the same calm confidence Alexander had noticed earlier that morning. "It is nice to see you again, sir," Jordan said respectfully. Alexander could not help smiling in return. "The pleasure is mine," he answered honestly. "I have been hoping to thank both of you." Simone listened without interruption as Alexander explained how deeply the unexpected moment had affected him. He spoke carefully, choosing sincerity over polished business language. When he finished, he reached into his jacket and quietly removed a business card. "If there is ever anything I can do for your family, I would be honored." Simone accepted the card with appreciation but made no move to examine it. Instead, she slipped it into the pocket of her coat as though the gesture itself mattered more than the name printed across the front. "Thank you," she replied. "Kindness should always be acknowledged, but it should never become a transaction." Her words settled gently between them. Alexander noticed there was no bitterness in her voice, no suspicion, only a peaceful certainty that seemed remarkably rare. Before he could respond, Jordan pointed toward a small community center across the street where children were gathering after school. "Mom, we promised Mrs. Alvarez we would help set up the reading room." Simone nodded with a smile. "We should not keep people waiting." Alexander glanced toward the modest brick building where volunteers carried folding chairs and boxes of donated books through the front entrance. Curious, he asked, "Do you both volunteer there?" Jordan answered before his mother could speak. "Every Tuesday and Thursday. We read stories to younger children after homework hour." Alexander looked from the boy to Simone with genuine surprise. "That is wonderful." Jordan shrugged modestly. "Reading helped me become brave. Maybe it can help someone else too." Those simple words stayed with Alexander as they crossed the street together. Inside the community center, Colorful drawings decorated the walls while shelves filled with gently used books lined a cheerful reading corner. Parents greeted Simone by name. Children rushed toward Jordan with excitement, asking which adventure story he would read that afternoon. It quickly became clear that this family was deeply loved by everyone around them. Simone helped arrange chairs while Jordan carefully stacked picture books according to reading level. Neither expected recognition. They simply served where they were needed. Alexander quietly rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt and began helping move tables into place. Several volunteers thanked him without realizing who he was. For the first time in years, he experienced the quiet satisfaction of contributing without cameras, interviews, or applause. As the room slowly filled with children, Jordan selected a well-worn storybook and climbed onto a small reading stool. The younger children gathered around him with eager smiles. Alexander stood near the doorway, watching the boy read each page with patience, humor, and kindness. Every child listened as though the world outside no longer existed. Simone noticed Alexander observing the scene. She stepped beside him and said softly, "Jordan believes every person deserves someone who makes them feel seen." Alexander kept his eyes on the smiling children. Someone taught him that. Simone smiled gently. Children usually become what they experience every day. As sunlight streamed through the tall windows and settled across the rows of books, Alexander felt an unexpected sense of familiarity. Something about Simone's quiet grace, her steady voice, and the peaceful atmosphere surrounding her stirred a memory resting just beyond reach, a memory that refused to reveal itself but seemed determined to return. When the last child left the reading room carrying a borrowed book and a hopeful smile, the community center slowly settled into a peaceful silence. Volunteers folded chairs while parents exchanged quiet conversations near the entrance. Jordan carefully returned each storybook to its proper shelf, treating every worn cover with the same respect someone might offer a treasured family photograph. Alexander remained nearby, helping stack tables even though no one expected him to stay. The work itself was simple, yet it felt strangely meaningful. As he lifted the final box of donated books onto a storage cart, something slipped from between two hardcovers and landed softly on the wooden floor. It was an old framed photograph with a slightly cracked corner. Alexander instinctively bent down to pick it up before the glass could be scratched. The moment his eyes settled on the image, his breathing slowed. The photograph showed a younger Simone standing beside an aging pickup truck on a rainy afternoon many years earlier. She looked almost the same, only younger, wearing a denim jacket instead of the beige coat she wore today. Beside her stood an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered smile. Behind them, partially visible in the background, was a silver luxury sedan with its hood raised beside a quiet country road. Alexander stared at the picture for several long seconds. Something inside his memory shifted. A forgotten afternoon began returning piece by piece. It had happened nearly 12 years earlier when he was still struggling to build his first investment company. On the morning of the most important meeting of his young career, his car had broken down on an isolated highway outside Albany during a heavy autumn rainstorm. Cell phone service had disappeared. Every passing minute had carried the possibility of losing the only opportunity capable of saving his business. Then an old pickup truck had stopped. An elderly mechanic and his daughter had offered help without hesitation. They spent nearly an hour repairing enough of the engine for him to continue driving. When Alexander reached for his wallet, the mechanic smiled kindly and refused every dollar. The young woman standing beside him had simply said, "If life is ever kind to you, pass that kindness to someone else." Alexander remembered thanking them before rushing toward the meeting that ultimately transformed his career forever. He had searched for them afterward, but the repair shop had closed months later, and every trail eventually disappeared. His gaze returned to the photograph trembling gently in his hands. The young woman in that forgotten memory was Simone. Before he could gather his thoughts, Simone quietly walked over carrying a box of children's art supplies. She noticed the photograph and smiled softly. "My father insisted on keeping that old truck long after everyone else thought it should be retired," she said fondly. Alexander slowly looked up at her. His eyes filled with disbelief. "That was your father?" Simone nodded. "Yes." He believed no one should ever be left stranded. The room became perfectly still. Alexander felt the years collapse into a single unforgettable moment. I have been looking for the people in this photograph for more than a decade, he whispered. Simone's gentle smile faded into quiet surprise as she searched his face more carefully. Recognition slowly appeared in her eyes. She glanced once toward the silver sedan barely visible in the old picture, then back at Alexander. Neither of them spoke. They no longer needed to. The answer had already been waiting inside a forgotten photograph all along. Alexander lowered himself into a nearby chair, as though the weight of 12 forgotten years had settled quietly across his shoulders. The old photograph remained in his hands while memories continued returning with remarkable clarity. He remembered the relentless rain, the silent country highway, the growing panic as every passing minute threatened to destroy the future he had worked so hard to build. He remembered searching desperately for a signal that never came. Then he remembered the old pickup truck stopping without hesitation. Simone's father had climbed out carrying a weathered toolbox while the young woman stood beside him holding an umbrella against the cold autumn rain. Neither of them had asked who Alexander was. Neither of them had wondered whether helping him would be worth their time. They had simply seen someone in need. When the engine finally started again, Alexander had offered every dollar in his wallet. The elderly mechanic had smiled kindly and gently closed Alexander's hand around the money. "Keep it," he had said. "Someday someone else will need you more than I do." Those words echoed through Alexander's mind with greater force than ever before. Simone sat quietly across from him inside the now empty reading room. "My father believed kindness only mattered when it expected nothing in return," she said softly. Alexander nodded slowly. "I searched for both of you after that meeting changed my life." Simone looked surprised. "You did? For almost a year," he admitted. "The repair shop had already closed. No one seemed to know where your family had gone." Simone smiled gently, though sadness rested behind her eyes. "My father became ill not long afterward. We moved to the city so I could work and care for him. Life became smaller for a while." Alexander understood more than she realized. The success he celebrated for more than a decade suddenly looked different through the lens of that forgotten afternoon. Every office tower his company occupied, every scholarship he had funded, every employee he had hired could be traced back to one rainy morning when two strangers refused to leave him alone beside a broken car. Jordan quietly entered the room carrying the last stack of children's books. He noticed the thoughtful expressions on both adults and paused. "Did something happen?" he asked. Simone smiled warmly at her son. "We were remembering an old story." Jordan carefully placed the books onto the shelf before sitting beside his mother. "Grandpa always said old stories help people make better new ones." Alexander looked at the boy with admiration. "Your grandfather was a very wise man." Jordan's eyes brightened immediately. "You knew Grandpa?" Alexander hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "He helped me once when I needed it more than I realized." Jordan smiled with quiet pride. "That sounds like him." The simplicity of the child's response touched Alexander deeply. There was no expectation of reward, no curiosity about wealth or influence. Jordan simply seemed grateful that his grandfather's kindness had continued living inside someone else's memory. Alexander slowly stood and looked around the modest reading room filled with donated books, handmade artwork, and well-loved furniture. He realized no amount of money could ever repay what Simone and her father had unknowingly given him. It was not transportation on a rainy afternoon. It was an entire future. As evening sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. He would honor that forgotten kindness, not by writing a check or offering charity, but by discovering what it truly meant to pass goodness forward exactly as Simone's father had hoped all those years ago. Over the following weeks, Alexander returned to the community center every Thursday without making announcements or arranging photographers. He arrived carrying folded chairs, repaired loose bookshelves, sorted donated books, and quietly joined the volunteers wherever an extra pair of hands was needed. At first the neighborhood assumed he was simply honoring a promise after the unusual meeting on the sidewalk. Only Simone understood that something much deeper was changing inside him. She watched him arrive before sunrise. One Saturday to help repaint the reading room alongside parents, teachers, and local college students. His expensive watch disappeared beneath work gloves, and no one heard him mention board meetings or business awards. Jordan noticed the difference as well. One afternoon, while they organized children's books by reading level, he looked up at Alexander with innocent curiosity. "Do rich people always do this?" Alexander smiled as he carefully placed another book onto the shelf. "No," he answered honestly. "But they should remember that success means very little if it never reaches someone else's life." Jordan nodded thoughtfully before returning to his work. Simone overheard the exchange from across the room, and although she said nothing, a quiet respect began replacing the careful distance she had maintained. One evening, after the last family had gone home, Alexander waited until Jordan stepped outside to water the small flower beds with another volunteer. He turned toward Simone, speaking gently. "I have spent weeks thinking about your father's words. I finally understand that I cannot repay what your family did for me." Simone smiled kindly. "I never expected you to." Alexander reached into his coat, not for a check or an envelope, but for a folded notebook page covered with handwritten notes. "Then allow me to honor it instead." He unfolded the paper across the table. It contained plans for expanding the community library, creating after-school tutoring programs, and offering college scholarships funded anonymously so no building or classroom would carry his name. Simone read every line carefully before looking back at him. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. Alexander nodded. "Not because I rescued anyone. Because someone rescued me years ago, and I almost forgot the lesson." Simone closed the notebook gently. "This is beautiful," she admitted. "But only if you promise me one thing." "Anything. Do not build this so people remember your generosity. Build it so children never have to wonder whether someone believes in them." Alexander smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle into his heart. "That is exactly what I want." That moment Jordan hurried back inside carrying a small clay flower pot painted by one of the younger children. He placed it carefully into Alexander's hands. "This is for you," he said proudly. Everybody planted flowers today, and Mrs. Alvarez said visitors should take one home. Alexander looked at the uneven brushstrokes and tiny blue flowers painted around the rim. It was worth only a few dollars, yet it instantly became one of the most meaningful gifts he had ever received. "Thank you," he whispered sincerely. Jordan stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Alexander in a spontaneous hug. Without hesitation, Alexander returned the embrace, holding the boy gently as though protecting something priceless. Simone watched the quiet moment from only a few feet away. The evening sunlight poured through the tall windows, surrounding the three of them with warm golden light. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe that gratitude, when lived instead of spoken, could slowly become the beginning of an entirely new future. Autumn gradually surrendered to winter, and the small community center became busier than ever. Word spread quietly throughout the neighborhood that new books, tutoring sessions, and educational programs were becoming available, yet very few people knew who had made them possible. Alexander had insisted that every donation remain anonymous. The only names displayed anywhere inside the building belonged to local teachers, volunteers, and longtime residents whose dedication had shaped the community for years. When his legal team suggested placing a bronze plaque recognizing his generosity, he politely refused. "The children should walk through these doors believing this place belongs to them," he explained, "not to the person who paid for new shelves." Simone heard about his decision from Mrs. Alvarez several days later. She smiled to herself, realizing that Alexander had finally understood the lesson her father had tried to teach all those years ago. Gratitude became real only when it quietly multiplied instead of seeking recognition. One Saturday morning the community gathered for the reopening of the expanded reading room. Families filled the hall with laughter while volunteers arranged fresh flowers and homemade desserts along folding tables. Jordan proudly helped younger children choose books to borrow for the weekend. Every time someone thanked him for his kindness, he simply pointed toward another child who needed help, reminding everyone that stories became more meaningful when they were shared. Alexander arrived carrying several boxes of brand new children's books without any company logos or public announcements. He quietly placed them in the storage room before joining the volunteers to arrange chairs. Most of the parents recognized him now, not as a famous businessman, but as the dependable man who always arrived early and stayed until every table had been folded away. During the celebration, Mrs. Alvarez invited Jordan to read the opening story aloud. The little boy stood confidently before dozens of smiling families and opened a beautifully illustrated picture book. His clear voice filled the room with warmth, imagination, and gentle humor. Children leaned closer with every page while parents exchanged proud smiles. Alexander watched from the back of the room, realizing that leadership looked very different from what he had once believed. It was not standing above people. It was helping others discover their own voices. After the reading ended, enthusiastic applause echoed throughout the building. Jordan stepped down from the small platform and walked directly toward Alexander. "Would you help me put the books back?" he asked naturally. Alexander smiled. "I would be honored." Together they carefully returned every book to its shelf. As they worked, Jordan looked up thoughtfully. "Mom says people become part of your family because of love, not because of money." Alexander paused, gently sliding one final book into place. "Your mother is very wise." Jordan nodded. "I think Grandpa taught her that." Before Alexander could answer, Simone entered the room carrying warm cups of cocoa for the remaining volunteers. She watched the quiet conversation between the two of them with gentle eyes. There was no longer uncertainty in her expression. Trust had arrived, slowly built through ordinary moments instead of extraordinary promises. She handed one cup to Alexander and another to Jordan before quietly saying, "My father would have been very happy to see this." Alexander accepted the warm cup with gratitude, looking around the room filled with children laughing, parents talking, and volunteers serving one another without expecting anything in return. For the first time since that rainy highway years ago, he truly understood that the greatest legacy a person could leave behind was not a successful company or an impressive fortune. It was inspiring someone else to choose kindness long after you were gone. Spring arrived quietly, bringing fresh green leaves to the trees surrounding the community center and filling the neighborhood with a renewed sense of hope. The reading room had become a place where children hurried after school with excitement instead of obligation, and parents often stayed long after the tutoring sessions ended simply because they felt welcomed there. Alexander no longer measured his weeks by business meetings alone. He measured them by Thursday afternoons when Jordan eagerly waved from the library window, by the sound of children laughing over new stories, and by the peaceful conversations he shared with Simone while the last rays of sunlight stretched across the wooden floors. One evening, after the volunteers finished cleaning the reading room, Jordan invited Alexander to walk with him through the small community garden behind the building. Flowers planted by neighborhood families had begun to bloom, and tiny wooden signs carried the names of the children who cared for each garden bed. Jordan stopped beside a young maple tree that had been planted in memory of his grandfather. He carefully brushed a few leaves with his fingertips before looking up at Alexander. "Mom says Grandpa believed every person leaves something behind," he said thoughtfully. "Some people leave buildings. Some leave money. Grandpa left kindness." Alexander nodded gently. "Your grandfather changed my life without ever knowing what happened afterward." Jordan smiled. "I think he would like knowing that you are helping other people now." The simple words settled deeply into Alexander's heart. Later that evening, Simone joined them beneath the growing tree. The three of them stood quietly as birds settled into the branches overhead, and the neighborhood slowly prepared for another peaceful night. Simone looked toward the children playing near the playground before speaking. "Jordan has been asking me something for weeks." Alexander turned toward the boy with curiosity. Jordan hesitated for a moment, then gathered his courage. "I wanted to know if it would be all right if I called you my friend." Alexander's eyes softened immediately. He knelt so they were at the same height. "Jordan," he said warmly, "being your friend would be one of the greatest honors of my life." The boy smiled with quiet happiness before wrapping his arms around Alexander in another heartfelt embrace. Simone watched the moment with gentle gratitude. She realized the friendship growing between them had never been purchased, arranged, or expected. It had been earned one ordinary act of kindness at a time. As they walked back toward the community center, Alexander noticed a faded bulletin board near the entrance covered with handwritten requests from neighborhood families. Some asked for school supplies, others for reading tutors or children's winter coats before the next season arrived. Instead of removing the board or replacing it with something modern, He quietly suggested adding another section beside it where neighbors could offer help directly to one another. Within days, the board became filled with handwritten notes from people willing to share time, skills, and encouragement. A retired teacher volunteered to tutor mathematics. A local baker offered free bread every Friday. College students organized weekend science clubs. The neighborhood itself became stronger because people discovered they had something valuable to give, regardless of their income. Watching the board fill with hopeful messages, Simone smiled at Alexander. "You finally understood my father's lesson," she said softly. Alexander looked around at the families greeting one another with warmth and quiet generosity. "No," he answered with a peaceful smile. "I finally understood that your family never changed my future by fixing a car. You changed it by teaching me that the greatest wealth is measured by how many lives become brighter after you quietly walk beside them." 1 year later, the first cool days of autumn returned to Manhattan, carrying the same gentle breeze that had quietly changed 3 lives forever. The community center stood brighter than ever, its reading room filled with shelves overflowing with books, colorful artwork created by neighborhood children, and laughter that echoed through every hallway. Families no longer spoke about what had once been missing. They spoke about everything they had built together. The small maple tree planted in memory of Simone's father had grown stronger, its branches stretching confidently toward the morning sky. Beneath its shade, Jordan welcomed a new group of children arriving for their first reading club. Some were shy. Others clutched borrowed books with uncertain hands. Jordan greeted each one with the same warm smile he had once offered a stranger on a busy Manhattan sidewalk. "Come with me," he said gently. "I will show you where our stories begin." Alexander stood nearby, watching with quiet pride. The simple words carried him back to the moment when a thoughtful child had unknowingly redirected not only his footsteps but the entire course of his life. His company continued to grow, yet the achievements that now mattered most could not be measured in financial reports. Every Thursday he still arrived before anyone else to arrange chairs, repair worn book covers, and welcome new volunteers. The neighborhood no longer viewed him as the millionaire from the newspapers. To them he had become another familiar face who always remembered birthdays, carried heavy boxes without being asked, and stayed until every child had found the right book to take home. Later that afternoon, the community gathered outside for the dedication of a small outdoor reading garden. There were no television cameras, no elaborate stage, and no speeches celebrating wealth. Instead, children planted flowers beside the walking paths, while parents shared homemade meals under strings of warm lights. Mrs. Alvarez invited Jordan to place the first book inside a weatherproof reading box built for anyone passing through the neighborhood. Jordan carefully selected a well-loved adventure story, before closing the little wooden door with a satisfied smile. "Now someone else gets to discover it," he said happily. Simone looked toward Alexander, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and quiet affection. "My father always believed that kindness should keep traveling," she whispered. Alexander reached gently for her hand. He was right. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without hesitation or uncertainty, as though trust had quietly grown into something deeper through countless ordinary days. Simone stepped a little closer and placed a soft kiss on Alexander's cheek, not as a grand declaration, but as a peaceful acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. Jordan looked up, smiled knowingly, and laughed before running back to join the other children beneath the maple tree. As the evening sun bathed the neighborhood in warm golden light, Alexander glanced once toward the busy city skyline rising in the distance. He remembered the man he had been before an unexpected voice asked him to change direction. Back then he believed success meant always knowing where to go. Now he understood that the greatest moments in life often begin when someone else's kindness quietly leads the way. Around him, children turned pages, neighbors shared stories, and strangers became friends. The richest investment he would ever make had never been a company, a building, or a fortune. It had been choosing to follow a small act of goodness, until it became a legacy that would continue touching hearts long after every headline had been forgotten.